1991. And about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, we're ready to go.
It's running now.
Yep, it's running now. Talk about when you were a boy and your family and...
Well, I suppose that there are lots of things in the family history that are interesting enough to record. You've heard me talk enough about the family history that you remember some of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like anything else, as long as it sometimes is lost. Family history is frequently lost unless you get it down. I have always been quite proud of some of the historical background of my dad's family. And he was very proud of the fact that he was born in Centennial Year, 1876, which was the 100th anniversary of the signing, of course, of the Declaration of Independence. And 1876 was also the year of the Custer's massacre at the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, being a centennial year, they had lots of celebrations. Of course, he didn't know anything about it, but he was born in that year, in September the 8th, 1876.
And his name was?
And his name was James W. Van Kirk. James Washington Van Kirk was actually, and he was the youngest of a large family. In fact, once upon a time, I guess I knew, but I don't even remember how many there were in the family. But because in those days, they had extremely large families. But he was the youngest of the family, and his father died before he was born. And so that was something that was always interesting to me, that Dad was the youngest, and his father died of a heart attack before he was born.
Hmm.
And they were living, he was born in Illinois, northern Illinois. As I recall, well, offhand, I was thinking it was Monmouth. They lived at Monmouth, Illinois later. But that was actually not the name of the where he was born, in northern Illinois, but was in the Monmouth vicinity. And he grew up there. The family had come from Kentucky, and they had been Confederate. They had come from Kentucky. Kentucky was a border state. And the family had lived at Maysville, Kentucky, and actually they had had slaves, several slaves. And after the Civil War, it was very difficult for anybody who had been a Southern sympathizer to live anywhere, including the South. And so they left. In the first place, the slaves were like members of the family. And, but if you...
What type of business was he in, and what did it...
I think they
afford
were
him?
farming. I think they were farm people. I'm sure they were.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you, under the Reconstruction period, the conditions, if you permitted the slaves to stay in their cabins on the farm, you might be accused of keeping them in slavery.
Hmm.
At the same time, conditions were such that they couldn't afford to pay them. I mean, support them. So they had to make a choice. So what they moved off. They sold the, I guess, the land and left the whatever arrangements they made. They left when they left, the people who had been slaves were still living in their cabins, and they just simply moved away and left them there for the problem to be solved by the next owner or whatever, you know, the next owner of the land. And they moved to Illinois, a northern state. I've heard my dad tell about he had an uncle who had fought in the Confederate side in the Civil War, and when they moved to northern Illinois, my dad said that whatever his name was, this old uncle, he would go to town. This is why I say I know that they lived on a farm, on a farm. He'd go to town on Saturday night and fight the Civil War battle all over again. Come home, get drunk, and come home all beat up and so forth. But anyway, they lived in northern Illinois, and until my dad was 10 years old. In 1886, my grandmother and the two older boys in the family, Uncle Henry and Uncle Clay, were both in their early 20s, so they could more or less, they were grown men, and they could more or less serve as the man of the, the men of the family. And grandmother bought a farm in Antelope County, Nebraska. And they decided that they were going to move out.
And she was raising these children all by herself.
And so I suppose conditions were not so great in northern Illinois, and anyway, the land was cheap out here on the frontier. And so they came with a party, a group of covered wagons. Imagine, in 1886, they came in a covered wagon train across Iowa. My dad remembered it because he was 10 years old, and he had another among the family who came. Some of them, all of them didn't come. Some were, one or two stayed back there in Illinois, but they were old enough to do so. But Uncle Henry and Uncle Clay came with the family to Nebraska. And they came and they crossed the river. Oh, my dad's sister, older sister, she was already married, and she and her husband had settled in Nebraska already, down in Richardson County. And so when they came, they decided that they would visit them. So they came to Nebraska, and they crossed the river at Nebraska City, on a bridge at Nebraska City. You didn't just, there weren't as many bridges in those days. You had to pick your place, and Nebraska City was an historic crossing. And they crossed the river at Nebraska City, and they went to Richardson County, and they visited Aunt Betty, my dad's sister, and her husband, and they had, Aunt Betty and Uncle Will had, Vandiver had children at that time. And they came, then when they left Richardson County, they came north, and by that time, the covered wagon party had pretty much split up. But they headed for Antelope County, and they came through Lincoln. And I didn't know this, but I talked to somebody who did know. I had forgotten it. But my dad had told him that he remembered that they had camped They had stopped here at Lincoln, and they had camped in an open area which was reserved for that sort of thing, south, in the south part of Lincoln, of what is now Lincoln, south from the Capitol building. And he could remember their staying, camping out overnight here, and then they went on north to Antelope County. And grandmother had bought a farm in Antelope County, as I had mentioned, and it was a good farm. It was a good livestock farm. Just 160 acres, but 160 acres was much bigger in those days than it is now, because everything was done by horses and by hand.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, being the youngest, they had tough times. Uncle Clay and Uncle Henry, I'm sure, did the farming in the first few years, and then they went on. They were older men. They went on, they married, and they went to move to Neely. And later, grandmother sold the farm, and she moved to Neely. But my dad, as a little boy, was, and they were tough times, and they more or less farmed him out, and in the summers. And he'd go to school in the wintertime, but he worked for a ranch south of Neely called the Getchell Ranch. In those days, there were still open range. In other words, government land that ranchers grazed. And the Getchell Ranch was a big ranch south of Neely, and it had 2 or 3 different different places, ranch settlements, sub-buildings. And my dad, the first year he worked for them, he was 12 years old. And he herded cattle with on the open range, south of Neely, Sand Hills, and out beyond. He pointed out to me different places where, also a place near where we lived later, that was a Getchell sub-ranch. And one place that we farmed when I was growing up, my dad said, you know, I'm sure that here was a cookhouse. It was very obvious that this had been a building site, because the corn always grew, the soil had been compacted, and cattle had dragged in materials into the corrals. But the corn was always lighter on that spot. And he said, I'm sure that this is where there was a log cabin, cook shack.
Mm.
And he said, I am sure that right down there at the fork of those 2 creeks is where we used to stop and water our horses, and then ride on up here to the cook shack, and turn the horses loose in the corral while we had lunch, and they stayed there overnight too, a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, I can remember his telling me one time when we were picking corn together, he was telling me, he said how lonesome he got out there all by himself, herding cattle.
12 years
at
old.
12 years of age. And he said, you know, sometimes I'd cry.
Hmm.
But Dad worked for the Getchell Ranch for a good number of years, off and on, especially during the summer, spring, summer, and fall, and he'd go to school in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always amazed at my dad. We talk about education today. My dad acquired, he read well, he read lots of things, he could figure, his arithmetic was very good. He knew how to figure the square footage in buildings and all of that sort of thing. He always knew how much interest he was paying, and lots of things which we think of education. Well, he only got maybe the equivalent of he later went to school in Neely, and I think he went about he ended up with about a ninth grade, off and on, ninth grade education. But he could read well, and he thought well, and he had a knowledge of history. He liked history, and he was pretty good with common ordinary arithmetic. And I always appreciated that fact about my dad. He could read far better than many people today can read, because that's what they taught. One thing that I've always found interesting, I remember his telling us about how his experience in the great blizzard of 1888. He would have been 12 years old then. It was the second year that they had been there. But those who know weather history, it was the great blizzard that was a killer blizzard that swept across all the northern sections of the United States, and especially here in Nebraska. And it was one of the most violent blizzards of all time. But he was, and many school children and many teachers were lost. It started out as quite a mild day. They had had quite a mild winter. And it started as quite a mild day. They had gone to school, and along about 2 o'clock the wind hit. Tremendous wind. And the teacher, nobody was lost at that school, but the teacher got them started home quickly. And he didn't have terribly far to go, but he got home, and he and his brother, who was just a couple years older, one of the brothers was, Uncle Ed was just a couple years older than he. They got home, and they were, everything was just demoralized, just shut down for about 24 hours. And in that period, as I mentioned, it was a heavy snow and tremendous winds. And I can remember my dad telling about the huge drifts that they had. They had a drift at their barn, which was so deep on the north side that they could walk from the snow right into the haymow door. And that drift, he said, stayed there because it was protected. It was so deep. He said that snow didn't finally all melt until May. But then it got terribly cold right after the aftermath of the storm. But it was for many years they had a blizzard of '88 society here in Nebraska, in which it was only abandoned a few years ago because all of the original people who remembered had died. But my dad would always tell a story about how he had experienced the blizzard of '88 and what a terror it was.
Kind of like we remember the blizzard of '49.
Yes. The biggest next blizzard was the blizzard of 1945. My mother and her family, the Sheets family, her father's name was Henry J. Sheets, and the mother's name was Alice. They came from Illinois in 1894. Mother was born at Sugar Grove, Ohio in 1878. And she and Aunt Clara were born on a rough farm not too far from Columbus, Ohio. And after a few, that's where most of my grandfather and grandmother's family had lived. But after he was married, and they had had their first couple of children, my mother and Aunt Clara, they moved to Illinois, near Decatur.
Grandma's name was Laura
Sheets. And Grandma's name was Laura Ellen Sheets.
And she was born in January 1878.
1878.
Okay.
And they lived in Illinois for quite a number of years. Grandpa they rented a farm, a good farm near Decatur, and of course that was high-priced land. Mother, when they came to Nebraska in 1894, was a girl of 16. And Grandpa was a good farmer and a pretty good business manager, and they got ahead, but not as fast as he would have liked to have. And so they came to Nebraska. He bought a half section of land in Antelope County, one quarter of which I believe is one of the best pieces of land in Antelope County. But they bought a half section, 320 acres there, and that was a good sized amount at the time. One quarter of it was grazing land, pasture, and the other was farmed. And it had a house on it. It was not a homestead proposition. He bought it. And I can remember seeing the deed many years later. He gave $7.50 an acre for it. And I asked Mother one time, I said, how come that during the Depression years and during the drought years, how come that Grandpa and Grandma decided to come to Nebraska and leave that good Illinois land? And because they're back there, their moisture conditions and so forth it was better land and more reliable growing seasons and so forth. And Mother explained it to me that back there, even at that time, that land was selling for $250 an acre. And she said that out here in Nebraska, they could get good land, as I mentioned, for $7.50 an acre. He bought it for $7.50 an acre. 320. And she said rents were higher back there. The rents, he was paying 50%, half of the crop. Here in Nebraska, it was a third for the small grain and 2/5 for the corn, of the corn that you raised. That made a lot of difference. Anyway, they did well, and in a matter of in 1906, when Grandmother Sheets died, they had just built a new home, the home that later my folks lived in at one time, and Uncle Jimmy lived in that house, and it's still standing, and Ann lives in that house now. And James Weston bought the farm from his mother after his dad was no longer able to farm and had his health problems. In order to save it, James Weston bought it. And I mean save it from being lost to ill health and hospitalization costs and so forth. But it's a good farm, and that's where they lived, and that wasn't very far from where my dad had grown up and was living out in that area, and that's how, in those days, my dad and mother got together. They weren't very far from each other, and in that community. Mother, at 16, she attended. That fall, of 1894, she went to school at Gates College, which was a budding congregational college in Neely. And they didn't have high schools much in those days. And she got her teacher certificate. And so she taught country schools for a number of years before she was married.
I didn't know she was a teacher.
And she would, after she finished her last term, after she and Dad were married, of course, after you married in those days, well, you didn't teach, you just finished out your term and that was it. But I've heard her tell about how she drove a horse and buggy back and forth to school to finish out her teaching career. When they were first married, they bought, my dad had worked for the Getchell Ranch, and then he had begun to farm for himself. And he bought a quarter of land not very far from where the Sheets farm was, only a couple of miles. And when they lived there, that's where my mother and dad had the three oldest children. Virgil, Marvin, and Lois were all born on what they called the old Hind place. It was Hind.
H-I-N-D.
The old Hind place. And that was the name, I suppose, of the original homesteader. And after they had lived there a few years, times were relatively good, and they got ahead, and Dad was always inclined to speculate a little, and he bought a farm for 1 year, he bought a farm up by O'Neill, and they lived at O'Neill for 1 year, and raised a crop. Well, during that year, Grandma Sheets died. And Grandpa was left alone with, he had the boys at home. Aunt Clara was already married, but he had the older boys, Uncle Reuben and Uncle Manuel. Uncle Manuel was older than Reuben. It was Uncle Manuel, Uncle Reuben, and Uncle Oliver was a boy of about 12 years old, I think. Anyway, Grandpa Sheets he had gotten ahead, and in those days, without a woman in the house, to run the house and to provide the meals and so forth, you were pretty much at a handicap. So, he asked my dad and mother to come back there and run the farm, which they did. And they stayed there, I think, only a year or two. I'm sure that my dad and Grandpa Sheets probably didn't get along too great. And so they only stayed there a year or two. James was born at O'Neill in 1906, the year that they were at O'Neill. Anyway, my dad and mother bought a quarter of land up near Creighton, and they moved up to Creighton. And I think they were there only a couple of years. It was a good stock farm, but it had a high water table, some good wet pasture and hayland, but the problem was that they had a rather shallow well, and this was not good. Both my sister and my dad got typhoid fever, which was rather common occurrence in those days. And they had a rough time. My dad left him with somewhat of a rheumatic condition, and my sister she wasn't too well, of course. So they decided, in those days, the prescription was go to a high, dry climate. And so my dad and family got together and put the things together and took an immigrant car in those days in the railroad, and they moved to Holyoke, Colorado. And my dad went into the real estate business. They had a land boom on in northeastern Colorado, and he went in the real estate business, selling real estate. Got his license and sold real estate. I don't know if they had to have a license in those days or not, but anyway, that's what he did. And as long as the land boom held up, he did very well. But like all things, then the drought, that part of the country is very subject to drought. And within a few years, the bottom fell out of the land boom. And he was left, they had gotten ahead, and he had built a nice home there in Holyoke. And I would suppose that was probably the happiest times of my folks' married life, I'm guessing. They were young people, and they had lots of friends in Holyoke, and for a time they were doing well, and they had Virgil and Marvin and Lois and James, the four older boys. Anyway, times got tough. My dad was buying and selling land all the time, Anyway, when times got tough, he ended up with a quarter of land, small ranch. It had a bunch of school land, leased land. In addition, there was a whole section next to it that he had a lease on. So, and it had a sod house on it. Wasn't too desirable, of course, but it wasn't a bad piece of land. And with the school section, it was enticing. So anyway, that's what he had, and they ran out of money. They were running out of money, so they kept their house in town. Mother and the kids lived in the house in town in the wintertime during school year, and Dad went out on the ranch. He ranched and farmed, and started a herd of cattle, and raised horses, and they had a struggle, a bit of a struggle, and Wayne was born in that sod house, and I was born in that sod house. And when you speak of the sod house, it was finished inside. It had doors, and wood doors and windows, and it had wood shingles, wooden roof on it. But the walls were sod.
And the floor was?
And the floor was wood. It wasn't a sod floor, but it was cool in the summers and warm in the winters, and not too bad. But they wanted to get rid of it. They had plans to, if they had stayed there, to build a new home. But after I came along, Dad had made quite a little. The war came, and he made quite a bit of money in wheat and selling horses to the army, and he had a good herd of cattle, and he did very well. And Virgil was graduating from high school. The spring after I was born, they moved. Dad had bought a...
Your birth date is?
November 26th, 1917. And the war was in progress. And Dad had... his uncle, my Uncle Henry, was in the real estate business in Neely. And land prices were booming. And somehow or other, Dad got talked into buying this piece of land for speculation there at Elgin. It wasn't a real good farm. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't bad. Dad was looking at, he looked at ranches up in the mountains. He was looking for a change, or staying where he was and building a new house and buying some more land there. Actually, he said many times, if I had just stayed there, we'd have been better off. But they moved back to Nebraska, and they rented some extra land. Virgil stayed in Holyoke and finished his high school. And Marvin and Lois went to finish their high school there at the... Marvin graduated the following year at Elgin, and then Lois graduated at Neely in 1920. But I remember the 20s as good years, relatively good years. Of course, I was just a little boy. But I remember bank failures, and I remember hard times too. But through the 1920s, we got along quite well. And I can remember that we, many times, Dad fed cattle in the winters. And I can remember, about 1928 or 29, he felt real good. He'd sold some cattle, and I remember how good he felt about it. And I said to him, he said, I've got all my bills paid, and I'm well ahead. And I said, well, did you pay off the mortgage on the farm? And he said, no. He said, that's the cheapest money I can borrow, $5,000. Do you know that within 10 years, the Depression had come on, and the terrible drought had come on of the 30s, and we lost that farm for a $5,000 mortgage. In 1929, he turned down an opportunity to sell that farm for $30,000. He said, I just sold it. But, you know, hindsight is great. But we lost the farm, we couldn't pay, things got so tough that we couldn't keep up the interest on it, and nor pay the taxes, and we lost it. And he and Mother stayed there a few years. By that time I had gotten out of school, I had gone home and worked in the summers and so forth.
You went to college.
And I went to college in the winters, and I had a scholarship, and they helped me some, and what they could, and somehow or other I got it.
And you went to college where?
At Hastings College.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, after they lost the farm completely, they stayed there a few years. They rented the farm for a few years, and from the insurance company. And then the insurance company just sold it to a guy who was looking for an investment. And then later on, some neighbors of ours bought it. But before that time, my Uncle Oliver came. My granddad's Sheets estate had never really been settled. And Uncle Oliver was the administrator. And somehow or other, he had managed. Grandpa had to put a mortgage on that before he died, because things had gotten so tough. He lost money, he lost all his cash in 3 bank failures. Mm. And, but anyway, Uncle Oliver came to my folks and said, he said, I'd like to buy, he was living on the south quarter. He said, I'd like to buy the south quarter, if it's agreeable. And he said, I've talked to the other members of the family, and he said, would you consider buying the north quarter, which was the original quarter? And my folks really didn't have much of an alternative. Dad had made some money in hogs when the war came on, and he finally, crops had improved, and he finally had a good crop or two. And so between what Mother had and what they had put together in that last 2 years that they rented the farm, they were able to make a down payment on the farm over there and buy it from the estate. They got a federal land bank loan, and the war came on, and James was working back in Illinois, and folks talked to him. He couldn't, the Army didn't, he had a physical disability. And he came back and worked with them on the farm, and within a few years they had paid for the farm and gotten ahead again. And things turned out real good for them. My dad, at the time that they went back over there, can you imagine, he was 65 years old.
Starting all over.
And they managed. Well, that's about, anything you want to ask? Maybe that is too much history.
Well, let me hear about your childhood and about how maybe when you where you went to high school and then into your college years and your journalism and Chadron and on through there, where you met Mom and so forth. Go through that.
Well,
your darling daughters.
I'm going on and on.
They've got lots of faith.
Wayne and I went to the little country school there by Elgin, District 41, little one-room school. And as I say, I remember the 20s as relatively good years. We didn't have oversupplied with money, but we got along real well. And we could take a few trips and things like that to visit the older kids. And Virgil and Marvin were both married by that time. And Lois was teaching country school. And anyway, Wayne and I went to the little country school. And then he's 4.5 years older than I. He started a school in Elgin, which was 5.5 miles away. And he rode horseback most of his years going to Elgin. And then when he was a senior when I started as a freshman. And then after he got out of school, he went to Hastings College. He managed to go down there, and he pretty much worked his way through college with a little bit of help, you know. And I suppose... You
rode the horse back and forth to school?
And so I rode the horse back and forth to school, and in addition to riding with a neighbor girl. she was older than I, and she could drive, and I used to ride with her a good deal of the time. But I can remember many times when I had to ride the horseback when the roads were bad, and she stayed in town, and I would ride horseback. I can remember we had a big blizzard, and I rode horseback for 3 months until the roads cleared up. But anyway, sometimes I rode when things got good. I rode a bicycle back and forth to school, high school. But after I got out of school, high school, I did graduate. I did get a scholarship to Hastings, and my choice of a church school, and of course it was Hastings because Wayne was going there. And I stayed out of, we couldn't both be in school at the same time, so I stayed out of school a year, and this was good. It gave me a chance to grow up, mentally and physically.
And you were very young when you
I
graduated.
was very too young when I graduated from high school. I was only going on 16. I wasn't quite 16 yet. So anyway, that year was good.
Stop just a second. Tell a story about when you went to the movies.
Oh, I can remember going to the movies, and the cut was at 12 years of age, I think, between whether you paid a dime or a quarter. And the gal, when I graduated from high school, I was 15, and the lady selling tickets said, are you in high school? And I said no, because I had graduated. And so she let me in for a dime.
Because she thought you were under 12.
She thought I was under 12. 12 and under.
Yeah.
But
and you were already
it gave me a chance. I grew up. Mentally and physically. I worked on the farm that year, and James and Dad were farming rather large acreage, and so I did farm work with them, and I enjoyed myself, and in many ways I didn't go anywhere. I just worked out on the farm, but it was good for me. I grew up, and James and I were quite close, and my dad and I, we picked corn together and had visited, and I learned an awful lot. You learn an awful lot about your family history and people by working with them, scooping grain together and picking corn together and haying together and visiting, you know, and it was good for me. And then in the fall of '34, I started Hastings College, and I struggled. Don't think I didn't. But somehow or other, the 4 years went rapidly, and I got through. It helped me that when I was a junior, second semester, they named me editor of the college paper. And then the following year, normally they changed every semester, but the following year, they had decided that they would have co-editors. And but this other boy, whom they named a co-editor, he had poor health, and he was a very talented individual. But he got sick, and he never came back to Hastings College. He had to go south, down in Arizona for his health. He went to school down there. So anyway, that helped me a good deal in that I was the editor the first semester as a senior. And the little cash salary that they paid per week really helped me a great deal. In addition, I was working in the college dining hall for my board and room and washing pots and pans. And the next year, I waited tables. My last year, I waited tables, and I worked in the college publicity office for my room in the dormitory. So, somehow or other, I managed. And, I washed windows and beat rugs for people and cleaned houses and all that sort of thing for spending money. And so that's how I signed some notes, and I got some extra scholarship, too, from the journalism scholarship, an extra one. And so all in all, I came out owing money to the college, but I made it. And it took me a couple of years to pay it off, but I finally got it paid off. I took my first job with the North Platte Telegraph in North Platte, a daily newspaper in North Platte. Things were tough, and there were two competing dailies. And there they decided that they could use me better as an ad man. So I said, I've never sold advertising. And they said, well, you don't have a choice. You're going to sell it or else. So I learned to sell advertising. And I got rather good at it. I managed very well.
You paid on commission.
But I
That'd
did,
be
yes,
good, huh?
no, I wasn't on commission. No, you just eked out an existence. But I managed to become a good ad salesman. And not on my say-so, but on what my peers said.
Mm-hmm.
And after 2 years there, I couldn't get, it was a very low salary situation with two competing newspapers, so I had some connections, and I made an interview, got an interview, and I went to the Scottsbluff Daily Star Herald, which was the best, and I went there as an advertising salesman. My competitors actually recommended me for that job in Scottsbluff.
They wanted to get rid of you.
Because I didn't tell my current employer until after I had the job.
Uh-huh.
And they had checked with them on references afterwards, but I didn't want it aired around that I was seeking a job. I wanted to hold one job until I got another one.
Sure.
But the move to Scottsbluff was the best one I made. And because I went to work for, it was owned in those days by the Wisner family, and Mr. Wisner was one of the finest people I've ever known. Was a very, even then he was getting up in years, but he was one of the most, for those days, he was one of the kindest, most enlightened. He believed in paying his people a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
And the paper was well run and prospering. And that's where I had become acquainted with Maxine. We'd been going together. She worked for the North Platte Telegraph and as an assistant bookkeeper, and we had gotten acquainted and had dated. And anyway, after I went to Scottsbluff, she and I got married that summer. And we rented a furnished apartment there in Scottsbluff, and I worked there until I was called into the service.
And you were married
In
June
1940,
30th?
June 30th, 1940.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the war was in progress, and it wasn't, after a couple of years, well, in January 18th, 1942, our first daughter, Cheryl Ann, was born in the old Methodist Hospital downtown, which was a hospital right in the downtown section of Scottsbluff. And of course, we thought she was the greatest thing that had ever happened to us. Anyway, she was a little girl when I was called into service, and she and Maxine went to North Platte. Bless Grandpa and Grandma Guthrie. They looked after her. I went to her and Maxine. Maxine went to work for a drugstore and with a cosmetic counter sales lady and so forth, and assistant bookkeeper for them. And anyway, they looked after Sherry and Maxine while I was gone. I took my basic training at in the armored school at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And after I got through with my basic training, I came back to North Platte on a delay en route, and saw my folks who had by that time had moved over onto the farm near Plainview. Had gotten moved over there, and James had come back, who was with them. And I went immediately was sent to the staging area at Fort Meade, Maryland. Was there a few weeks for processing, and then they sent us up to Camp Shanks, New York, which is about 40 miles up the Hudson from New York City. Was there about 6 weeks waiting for a convoy to form, and traveled, we went across in a big convoy with a lot of escort because submarines were still active, German subs were still active, and we went across, and the convoy came down above Ireland into the Irish Sea, and we landed at Liverpool. And that was seeing Liverpool was the first time I'd ever seen bombing destruction, because it had been heavily bombed in 1940 and 41, all through those early years before we had gotten into the war. Mm-hmm. And we went down across Wales into southern England, to a camp in southern England. That's the big staging area. All southern England was a staging area for the invasion. And I can remember the invasion of Normandy started, the assaults on Omaha and Utah beaches started on June the 6th, 1944, as most people would remember. We had been in our camp there only about 3 days, I guess, and we knew that things were happening. And we heard the planes, thousands of planes, going over and coming back at night. And I can remember the day of the invasion. We had, they were giving us orientation and training and so forth, and we watched the huge flights of planes that were, they were towing supply. By that time the beach was secured early, and they were dropping gliders in on the beaches with supplies and even some personnel. Most of the personnel that went in from the air went in at night, dropped in behind the beaches at night, and took up a counteraction for the invading, for the beach forces. And then we saw thousands and thousands of planes through the days, watching them. They would go round the clock, back and forth, dropping bombs in support of the fighting, the beach operations and so forth. We were there, I was there until several places. They moved us around, they moved us closer to the beach.
What was your division? What were you
Well,
called?
later I joined I was a replacement.
Uh-huh.
I was going as a replacement. It was a big replacement outfit.
I see.
And these were replacement depots that we were going through. I went across the channel. We went on shipboard across, we left from Weymouth, the port of Weymouth, and we crossed the channel on a troop ship, and then we were loaded onto landing craft, regular landing craft, to go, we landed, the group I was with landed at Utah Beach. And we were trucked then around to a place back of Omaha Beach. And we were there until, well, we later moved up. We kept moving right behind the Army. And
what was your rank in the service?
I was a private at that time.
At that time. Mm-hmm.
And we followed, we moved up. The next move we made after we had been at the Omaha Beach area, the breakthrough came. We watched the big bombing at St. Lo, and the next move we moved down to St. Lo. The replacement camp would just move. We were in pup tents anyway, and we moved on down. We kept following along behind until, guys were being called out and sent, assigned to replace. Mm-hmm. As people were injured and killed and so forth, why, you went in as a replacement. And I was with them along with the replacement. They didn't need me very badly. Well, the war went well, after the
Uh-huh.
breakthrough. And went down the last, remember I was south of Paris. Our replacement camp was south of Paris at the time that Paris was taken. Then we had a big, long move. Things were moving awfully fast. The German army kind of collapsed there for a little bit, and lots of prisoners taken, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, several hundred thousand. And they were retreating. And so there was not much, when you're moving that rapidly, the casualties are not particularly great. And finally, the last replacement depot camp that we were in was up in Belgium, not far from St. Vith, which is the famous, where the breakthrough later came through during the Bulge. But it was while I was up there in northern Belgium that I was assigned to the 5th Armored Division. They were in Luxembourg, and several of us, they had suffered some casualties, and several of us were assigned. And I went to a tank crew as a bow gunner with in this tank crew in the 5th Armored Division. They had lost about 3 tanks in one day, and so they had to have crews. And so I went in as a crewman on a tank, and I was with the tank crew. We were in Luxembourg, and then we were in northern Belgium, and we took part in the battle for the Hurtgen Forest, which was a prolonged, tremendously prolonged battle and a very costly one. And we were in the Hurtgen Forest at the time that the Germans mounted their Ardennes offensive, which was a concentrated drive just to the south of us. And what our forces did, they transferred us to another army and pulled us back. We were actually in Germany, in the Hurtgen Forest, and they pulled us back from that area. We were down almost to the Rohr River. And they pulled us back from there and assigned us as a flanking movement on the north flank near Eupen to keep the Germans from fanning out. They were coming through as a spearhead, and they had gotten as far as Bastogne, and we were positioned with forces on the north flank to keep them from going north to Antwerp, because their goal was to split us and go to Antwerp, which was the big port city in Belgium, which we were using by that time extensively. But fortunately, the troops held at Bastogne. Bastogne held. Patton's army came from the south. We, of course, held at the north, and we pinched off the Bulge. The Bulge actually lasted for a number of weeks, good number of weeks, and we finally pinched off. Our forces were committed in a final pinch-off in Belgium, in Germany. By that time we moved back into Germany, and we were assigned in a final pinch-off of the Bulge, the German offensive, in late January. And I can remember the attack we made in a blizzard that day. The snow was 2 or 3 feet deep, and we made a final attack during a big blizzard. And from then on, we went to, after the Bulge, our division was then attached to the 9th Army. And we made the attack in the spring that carried us down to the Rhine. And we waited at the Rhine for a number of weeks because all the bridges had been blown. The famous Remagen Bridge was south of us, and that's the one that our forces had captured and had held up for a few days to let a bridgehead go across. And then it finally collapsed. We were to the north, and we crossed on a pontoon bridge across the Lorraine. They had flown gliders ahead of us, dropped troops ahead of us, and they put in a pontoon bridge, and we took our tanks across the Rhine on a pontoon bridge. And then we just took off across late March, early April, across northern Germany. And when we got up about to as far as they were going, I had been asked if I would, they were short, that we lost lots of officers during the bulge. And I was asked if I would, my platoon leader recommended me for an OCS course, officer training course, which was had been set up back in France to train officers for replacement purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people that went back there were people like myself who had been through a couple of campaigns. And so, in late April, middle April, the first sergeant came up.
This would have been what year?
1945.
Mm-hmm.
Came up and said, "Hey, you're on orders to go back to France." And he picked me up and took me to a point, and I went back on a truck across the Rhine and got on a train and at Brussels, Belgium, and went to Paris and down south of Paris to an officer candidate school in an old French officers training area, and that's where I took my OCS. And after I got out of that, by the war had ended in Europe at that time, and we were all figuring we'd have to go to Japan.
And your rank was?
Second lieutenant.
Second lieutenant.
And we were there until, got plenty of time?
Mm-hmm.
We were there at that camp until early June. And then we were sent back into Germany and assigned to a replacement depot, again, out near Marburg. And I was, why don't you shut it off?
Okay, we just had a slight interruption with phone call.
I realize that I'm running on and didn't intend to, but I get wound up and I'm glad to stay with it.
And where were we?
Well, that first summer of 45, I was assigned as a platoon leader with the 36th Infantry Division in southern Germany, the Black Forest area of southern Germany. And while I was there, the big news came. We were just engaged in training exercises and so forth, and all of us figured that maybe we were going to have to go to Japan. That was the whole idea. And all the troops in Europe figured that we were going to have to go to the invasion, make an invasion in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But, as everybody knows, they dropped the bomb. The war in the Pacific had moved along and satisfactorily, and they dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. And I can remember how amazed, how awestruck we were when we heard that we had an atomic bomb and that it had been dropped. And we knew, the speculation was that it would be over quickly, and it was. It took a second bomb to drop. I think the first one was at Hiroshima, and the second one went at Nagasaki. I believe that's the sequence. It might have been the other sequence, but anyway, it brought that war to a conclusion. And immediately they started sending troops home. The 36th Division had been in combat from the time that in North Africa, and so they had had a large turnover of people. Yes, They'd had tremendous suffered. Had taken part in the Italian campaign and had lost tremendous numbers of people. And so many of them there were still a few who were originals from the North African campaign, but most of them had been replaced through the years. And anyway, all of them had enough points to go home, and the older ones, the ones that had been with them a long time. I had enough points to come home if I were an enlisted man, but I didn't have enough as an officer. So anyway, I stayed.
What do you mean by points?
Points. They sent you home according to how many points you had built up through combat, how long you've been over there, and so forth. And so I had enough points to come home as an enlisted, if I'd have been an enlisted man, but by that time I was an officer and it took more points. And so I stayed, and they assigned me, the 36th Infantry Division was sent home, sent back to the States. Naturally, they didn't have to go to Japan, so they sent them back to the States. And they were setting up their occupation forces, and I was assigned as a junior officer out of the replacement depot then. I went back to a replacement depot, and they assigned me to a prisoner of war camp as a second officer, as a junior officer at a prisoner of war camp at near Mannheim, at a little town called Lampertheim. And they had set up these were scattered all over Germany, West Germany. And we had about 350 German prisoners of war, and including some former SS troops. Barbed wire enclosures and so forth, guard towers and that sort of thing. The engineers had set it up. And there were only about eight American personnel, 2 officers and 6 enlisted men. And the guard duty was done by Polish displaced persons, former Polish army personnel. They had been in prison camps back when Poland was overrun in 1939. And they had been in some of the prison camps and concentration camps, and they were afraid to go home because the communists had taken over by that time in Poland, and frankly they were afraid to go home, and with good reason, because they were shipping them, they were taking them, grabbing them off, and either killing them or sending them to Siberia. The Russians were. So in order to send more troops home, they put our army, put uniforms on these people, dyed uniforms, and organized them into guard details. And they guarded the German prisoners of war and served as guards around the warehouses, American warehouses and so forth, army warehouses. So I was there a month or so that fall until the captain who was in charge, who was my senior in the camp, was transferred to a supervisory position in an area, not just a camp, but the area. They were moving out. It was actually a job for a colonel, and he was sent there to be in charge of the area, and that left me as the only officer out there, and I became the commanding officer. And I was there until along in January. They started disbanding the small camps like the one where we were, and I was transferred then over to the area headquarters and assigned in a liaison in the setup. I was an assistant to the liaison officer that worked with the Polish Guard units. And so I was there until June. I got to come home. And as a liaison. And I worked with the Polish officers, the the former Polish officers who are now serving as officers in these guard units and so forth. I worked with them, and I found it very interesting. I learned a great deal about the German, their trials and tribulations as prisoners of war, and the treatment that they had received from both Russians and Germans, and I got quite an education. I became good friends with some of them, and it was an interesting time for me. I came home, got back home, and back to the States, and was
This was June
released
what?
in 46,
46.
June of 46.
And you were there from what to what?
I was there from May 1944 until June 1946.
2 years in the service.
2 years. I mean, over there.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, I was longer in the service than that, but
Yeah.
that didn't include my, time in the States.
Sure.
So, actually, I wasn't in a full 3 years, but I was in a...
Were you drafted or did you join?
I was drafted.
I
I
see.
was drafted.
Mhm.
Was one of the first to be drafted with children,
Mhm.
when they got started. I had a low draft number, and by the time they started taking kids, people with fathers with children, I was one of the first to go in the county. But anyway, after I came back to North Platte, I should have taken a job right away, but I didn't. I had some reason. I've done a lot of stupid things. I had the idea that I wanted to go out to the Northwest. And anyway, I waited around all summer, and I must say that my in-laws put up with me. In September, I went with my brothers, Virgil and Marvin, on a trip up through Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, into Washington, and I was applying for jobs. And I took a job at Spokane, Washington, with the Spokesman Review and Chronicle, and I worked there as an ad man for a few months. Should have stayed, really. I was getting along pretty good, but I wasn't very happy. I wasn't happy in the big town. It was a
And
city.
Mom and I had moved up with you at that time.
Mom and Sherry had moved out there. Well, we lived in a slum. Really, we did. We lived in a slum area, and there wasn't much you could do about it. Housing was terribly hard to get. It was right after the war. We lived in an ex-workers area, and because it had been rented to them. Oh, it was miserable.
That's my first remembering.
Yes, it was pretty much of a
I
slum.
remember an old wood stove.
Wood stove and
Black wood stove,
yep,
and I don't...
we cooked with coal, and we had wooden sidewalks, and
Thin
neighbors,
walls,
paper thin walls, and so forth. Anyway, I got an invitation they had put the two papers together in Northwest, and I got an inquiry, would I be interested in coming back there and going to work for them as an ad salesman. And I took the job. So we moved back to North Platte. And it was hard to get a place to live there, too, especially with a child. But we did. We lived there until along in May. And the Wisners from Scotts Bluff came to me and said, we're thinking about buying the paper, the weekly paper, semi-weekly paper at Shadman.
This was what year?
This was in 47.
Mm-hmm.
I was working at the North Platte Telegraph at that time. It had been put together. Would you be interested? And we'll put you on a commission basis. I mean, a share the profit basis. And you can use what you get to buy stock.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I took the job. And we went up there. And it was a rough time. It was a rough go. The equipment had been hard to get, and it wasn't well equipped to begin with, and the equipment was old and failing, and had had needed to be replaced, but wasn't, and
This is the Shadden record.
this was the Shadron record,
Mm-hmm.
and I struggled. Help was hard to get too. But anyway, to make a long story short, we managed somehow, and things got better, and we were there 10 years. And Mary was born in April, April the 4th, 1950, in the little Shadron Municipal Hospital.
Mary Louise.
Mary Louise. And Sherry was going to school. She had started kindergarten at the Kenwood School the first fall we were there. And I can see her yet, taking her up to school and getting her started and so forth. Anyway, Mary came along, and we got along. We had our. It was never easy. We never made the money that we'd like to have made, but in the 10 years that we were there, I did manage to pay off what the Wisners had owed on the paper because they bought it with a down payment.
Mm-hmm.
Paid off what they owed on it, and I managed to acquire a 25% interest in it. And then they were never real happy with what they were getting out of it either. And Frank Wisner wanted to go to California. California was booming, and he wanted to go to California, and he wanted his money, naturally, out of what he had there. And so we agreed to sell it, and in 1957, we sold it. And we sold it to a fellow from Kansas who had a couple of, he had some money, his wife had a couple of wheat farms, and small wheat farms, and they, later on, that helped them to pay it off.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a good sale, and I had, Maxine and I had gotten ahead. I went back to the Star-Herald in Scottsbluff, and later on, after a couple of years, I became the editor of the Star-Herald, the news editor of the Star-Herald in 1960. And I was the news editor until 1966. And that was an interesting time for me. I know that I thought I was overworked and so forth, and I think I was, but I enjoyed the fact.
But you were also a workaholic.
And I acquired I was always accused of being a workaholic, and I guess maybe I was.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I was with the Star-Herald then until 66. Then I tried selling mutual funds for a while, but that didn't work out. I got my license, and I tried to sell mutual funds, and quite frankly, I wasn't making it. So I looked around for another job. See, whenever I wanted to change jobs, it was always tough to do. But I went to work for the Business Farmer in Scottsbluff, and it kept me there. We owned our home there, and it was better than every time you move, it cost you money. So I worked for the Business Farmer for about 2.5 years, and this job opening came up with the Public Relations Director at Nebraska Farm Bureau Federation in Lincoln. A number of people who were Farm Bureau members knew me out there and had become acquainted with me, and they really recommended me. My predecessor here in Lincoln had been killed in an auto accident. And so I applied for the job, and I got the job. And under the circumstances, one of the best moves I ever made, because during those years, apparently they were satisfied with me. I was with them 13 years, and during that time I edited their paper for them, and the Farm Bureau paper, and did their radio broadcasts, especially over KRVN at Lexington, and a number of other stations that we supplied tapes to. And also did a lot of reporting concerning the legislature. I had a daily broadcast over KRVN during the legislative session, during the days that the legislature was in session. And I learned a lot about the legislature and how bills are passed and the skullduggery that goes into it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very proud of all the things that I participated in, but I think I satisfied my employer, and I worked hard, and everything turned out pretty well. I retired in November 1982. You had to retire at 65.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thankful that we were able to. I always figured that I would probably have to work after I retired. But we had enough. They had a good retirement program, and I have been retired over 8 years now, and I have enjoyed that time, enjoyed relatively good health, and have not had to work. That's the story of my working activities. Our children grew up. Maxine worked for had worked and helped me a great deal at Shadron, in the Shadron Record. She served and pinch hit many positions. She had kept the books at times. She sold classified advertising for us, and she also sold some display advertising for us, and she could just fill in very capably where we needed her. In the final years there, she worked virtually full time. We had good help in looking after having somebody look after the kids when they were in school, and Mary was tiny. They had good people looking after them, girls that we thought a great deal of, and that were good to the kids, that really looked after them. So I don't think we shorted the kids anything, in any way. Sherry graduated after we went to Gearing. She graduated from Gearing High School. She had their final 3 years at Gearing. And Mary went all of her, she started kindergarten in Chapman and had her first grade in Chapman. But then she went the rest of the way in school in Gearing, and graduated from Gearing High School, and went a year to Nebraska Western College at Scotts Bluff. Sherry got married to Dick Blaha, and they lived in Laramie originally while he finished his last year in university. Then they lived in Denver for a few years, and we used to enjoy going over to Denver and visiting them.
Going up the mountains.
Yep. And their son Jeff was born in Denver, and then they went on to Minnesota, and were up there while we were. Some of the time, after we came here to Lincoln, they lived at Thief River Falls, Minnesota. We used to enjoy going up there and visiting them, and we would have Jeff and Connie come down and stay with us a week or two, a couple of weeks in the summertime. And we enjoyed always having the grandkids come and visit in those summers. And generally, it's been a relatively good. We can't complain about our life at all. Life has been good to us. We've had our health problems, but so does everybody. And generally, I enjoy my playing golf, and Maxine enjoys her bridge companions, and we're getting along fine. And we enjoy our children and grandchildren, and now our great-grandchildren. So that's about the story. Not a very exciting story, I'm not unhappy with my life, and I'm proud of some of the things I've done, and some of the things that I'm not very proud of, I'm not going to talk about. So,
I can't imagine.
That's
I
about
can't think
the
of
size of
any. I can't think of any.
oh yes, there have been some that weren't so good, but anyway, anything as a wind-up that you want to ask? I think I've thrown in everything but the kitchen sink.
Oh,
Gone on
sure.
for over an hour and a half. An hour and a half.
Yeah.
And you can cut out anything you want to. I'm sure that it has gone on much too long. But that's it for this time. Thank
Well,
you.
I won't cut a thing. This is great. Thank you. Love you.